Well, Bill, it's so great to connect today. We met at the Campbell Summit a while back, and I really appreciate you sharing your time with me today.
Hey, my pleasure, Nate. Good to be with you.
Of all the things you've learned about leadership, what lessons would you most want to pass on to others?
For me, my leadership journey began in college, really for the most part, when I was in the Naval ROTC there. But probably the five best leadership lessons I ever received were when I first got to my first SEAL team. So I was a young ensign. I'd just gotten out of SEAL training, and I arrived at what was referred to as Underwater Demolition Team 11. Back then, we had UDTs and SEAL teams. They were kind of one and the same. We eventually just brought them all together. But as a young officer, I had a Navy lieutenant who was a Vietnam vet. And I went to him and said, hey, look, I want to know what's it going to take to be a good officer in the SEAL teams. And he said, well, you need to go talk to the Master Chief. And the Master Chief was the senior enlisted guy at the team at the time. So I went and talked to the Master Chief and I said, Master Chief, what do I need to do to be a good officer in the SEAL teams? How do you earn the respect of the enlisted guys you're leading? Excuse me. And he said, well, there's a couple things you need to do. He said, first thing you need to do, and probably most importantly, is you need to work hard. You need to come in early. You need to work hard. You need to stay late. You need to come in on the weekends. He said, you don't have to be the most talented. You don't have to be the fastest, the strongest, the best tactician, but the guys will respect you if they know you are working hard, certainly working hard on their behalf. So hard work was to him the foundation of leadership. The next thing he said was, you need to know your business. And the business of being a SEAL meant you need to know everything about weapons. You need to know everything about demolition, about diving. You had to understand the business of being a SEAL. And the expectation, of course, as an officer was not that you were ever going to be as tactically and technically proficient as the enlisted guys, but you better understand all of the important aspects of the business of being a Navy SEAL. Next thing he said is you have to know the details. The details were important to him. In the SEAL teams, much like a football team or any place else, we had a playbook. And the playbook was based on a lot of plays that you run when you are in a tactical situation on the ground. Of course, all of my instructors were Vietnam vets, and they had been in ambushes in Vietnam. And when you get in an ambush, the first guy's got to move left, the second guy's got to move right. You got to pick up this field of fire. The details mattered. When you are a jump master and you're making sure somebody's getting ready to parachute out of a plane at 30,000 feet, you better get the details right. The next thing he said was, you have to be a good teammate. And we're called the SEAL teams for a reason, because we recognize it takes a team to get the job done. But being a good teammate to the Master Chief was important. He said, look, there are going to be days when you're not at your best and your buddies are going to kind of pick you up, dust you off, and keep you moving. And then there's days when, as a leader, you're going to have to either give one of the guys tough love, or you're going to have to lift them up, give them a certain amount of compassion, be a good teammate. And then the last one was the one that surprised me probably the most. He said, you have to be a good person as well. Now, the Master Chief had been a sailor in the Navy and the SEAL teams for a long time. He was a sailor's sailor. But his advice was, look, if you're a good person, then all of those things that other people that aren't necessarily good people have to worry about, they won't weigh upon you when you're leading. If you're a good person and you've done the right thing, you're going to find leading other men and women is easier if you're just a good person. So those five lessons kind of stuck with me throughout most of my career and beyond.
Really interesting. And the theme for this podcast is simple, practical, and underappreciated. And I think these five lessons are just perfect for that. So when you think about working hard, the first thing that comes to mind for me is it can be easy for us to think like, if I can just work smart and find the shortcut, then I can get what I want much faster. And so I think it's interesting that this first lesson that he shared with you was work hard.
Yeah, there's always, work smarter, not harder sort of thing. Certainly, if you can work smarter, always work smarter. But I think his point was not so much about doing, the smart things in a stupid way. It was, look, you've got to show effort. You've got to show up earlier than everybody else. You've got to work harder than everybody else. You've got to stay later than everybody else. You got to come in on the weekends. You're going to have to sacrifice something if you expect to be a great leader or a great teammate. And everybody can work hard. Not everybody can run a 9-800. Not everybody can run a 2-hour marathon. But everybody can work hard. And by working hard, you're going to take care of a lot of those talent shortfalls you might have inherent in whoever you are.
Yeah, what's that phrase by Michelangelo? Something about like they wouldn't admire me if as much as they knew how hard I worked, or something to
Right.
that effect, right? But I love that point too. Everybody can work hard. Okay, the next thing you said is know your business. You have to understand the aspects of your business. What were some of the challenges for you as you were coming up through the SEALs in knowing your business?
Yeah, again, the hard part is the business of being a SEAL requires a lot. It requires a lot of knowledge. So, we talk about shoot, move, and communicate. So you really had to know the weapons. And so I came into the SEAL teams. I went through basic SEAL training in 1977. I got my SEAL Trident in 1978. And all of my instructors when I went through SEAL training, then almost all of my teammates when I got to my first SEAL team were all Vietnam vets. And so they knew everything about every weapon. So, I mean, we had Stoner machine guns. We had M60 machine guns. We had M16s back then. We had CAR 15s were just coming in. You wanted to know everything about how that weapon worked. Demolition. We did a lot of demolition work. You did a lot of demolition work with haversacks and with Mark 75 hose, everything. And you needed to know everything about that. The communication systems, the radios we use, the PRC 25s, and how did a dipole antenna was made so you could do long distance communications. You needed to understand the business. You needed to understand the tactics. If you're in an ambush with a front-on guy, then you do an Australian peel-off. If you're in an ambush, L-shaped ambush, how do you move there? Everything required you to understand and know the details of the business. You were never going to be a great leader if you just understood something that was about an inch deep. Now, the problem with, again, to your question, Nate, I had a lot to learn as a young officer. Back to hard work. Well, this wasn't calculus. It didn't require you to be brilliant, but it did require you to come in early to the armory and spend time with the weapons, breaking them apart, putting them back together. It did require you to take every opportunity you could to go out and train with the guys, even if it wasn't on your daily schedule. So the hard work helped me in learning the business. And then you're a constant learner. Because, of course, weapon systems change, demolition changes. After 9/11, a whole lot changed. We got a whole lot of new equipment. We had new tactics. We had drones overhead. We had artillery on call. We had things that you had to understand even as a senior officer. So you have to know the business of the business.
Yeah, great point too. The first one, the hard work helps you with points 2 and 3 of
course.
knowing the business and the details. Okay, the next one you talked about, you have to be a good teammate. And one of the things you mentioned was tough love. And I remember you sharing a story, if you can talk about this, about a young SEAL member. And again, if we have to edit this, we can, because I don't know what you can or can't talk about. But anyway, you were talking about a young SEAL member who shot his teammate, and there was some tough love involved there.
Yeah, so this was back in the late 80s, and training mission going on, and it's a long story. I'll shorten it up for your audience here. But yeah, what happened was one of the SEALs who was the guy carrying the shotgun. So when you breach into a room, when you're doing a hostage rescue, back in the day, the breacher, the guy with the demolition, he would slap a demolition charge on the door. Everybody stacks behind the doors. We say you kind of file in on the side, and then he would crank it off with an electric blasting machine, generally a Claymore clacker, that would blow the door down. Then everybody would rush in. But if the Claymore clacker didn't work, and sometimes they were faulty, then the guy from the back with a shotgun would come walking around, and he'd blow off the hinges on the door so the guys could move in. Well, in this particular exercise, the guy at the very end had his gun down appropriately at low port, but he made the mistake of putting his finger in the trigger well. It was just kind of instinctive. He put his finger in the trigger well. When the blast went off, he accidentally pulled the trigger and shot the guy's leg off in front of him. So now, of course, we had to medevac the guy. We had to get this guy back. And now we were at this difficult position as leaders. I was the executive officer at a SEAL team, so the number 2 guy. In Navy parlance, the executive officer is number two. And then we had a command master chief who was a kind of salty old Vietnam vet, and the commanding officer. And the three of us were having a discussion about what do we do with this young man? He'd been a good SEAL. But as we went through the discussion, the master chief, who'd spent a lot of time in Vietnam, he had a completely different opinion. His idea was, look, the guy made a mistake, but mistakes happen in combat. And look, we need to just kind of bring him in and dress him down a little bit and then kind of get him back to work. But I had been reading a lot. And by that time, I was a reasonably experienced SEAL officer, and I had a different opinion. And I said to the commanding officer, I said, look, we have standards. We have standards in the SEAL team. So we understand that you never put your finger in the trigger well unless you're ready to pull the trigger. And he violated that standard. Doesn't make him a bad person, but he made a mistake, and we have to hold him accountable. So we got into this kind of heated discussion. Well, the commanding officer decided to side with me, and we brought the young man in, and he was a big strapping kid, and brought him in, and the commanding officer kind of threw the book at him. He busted him in rank. He took away half his base pay. He took away his SEAL Trident, which is the most revered thing we have as Navy SEALs, and he put him on a 1-year suspension. But an interesting thing happened. Because the burden of responsibility to some degree had been lifted off him, because for a while I'd seen him walking around the SEAL compound, and he was always kind of depressed because nobody had held him accountable for what he knew was an egregious error. Once we held him accountable to the maximum extent of what we could do, he actually kind of shoulders were back. He was like, okay, I made a mistake, but I was held accountable. And he went on to be a great SEAL. The next year, we gave him his SEAL Trident back because he performed well. The year after that, he became the Sailor of the Year for us. So it was tough love, but it was about accountability, Nate. It was about the fact that, again, you don't have to be a jerk about it, but if you want to be great, if you want to have a great team, it's about setting high standards and holding people accountable to those standards. If you don't have high standards, or you don't hold people accountable to those high standards, you're never going to have a great team, and you're just not going to be a great leader.
When I joined a football team in college, it was kind of a disaster. New coach took over, and the very first kind of core value was accountability.
Yeah, of course.
And it makes a lot of sense. And so, what a cool story, and it demonstrates the power of accountability. Okay, the last one you mentioned was you have to be a good person. I was thinking about something I heard recently in an interview, and somebody was saying, democracy works as long as people keep working on the system, and as long as you're a good person. The system itself can't save you. If you have a great system, but you have bad people running the system, it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. Yeah.
So go ahead.
No, go, please, Nate.
Well, I was going to say I'm all these lessons that I've been collecting from people I respect and admire. I'm working with a friend of mine who's another professor, and we're trying to summarize all of the lessons that we're learning. And kind of where we're at right now with this is work hard, work smart, and be a good person. Yeah. And so it's interesting that these are simple, but it doesn't make them easy.
It doesn't make them easy. I mean, this is one of the things that I point out a lot is, it's easy in leadership. It's easy to say, lead from the front, take care of your men and women, be people of good character. It's just hard to do. It's hard to do because we're human, because we have our foibles, we have, our faults and our failures. But being good can be hard, but it's not difficult to understand. And the easiest way is just to follow the simple golden rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. It actually started with Confucius back in 500 BC. It was called the Silver Rule with Confucius. But it was really just about, hey, look, you have to, treat other people the way you would want to be treated. That's it. I mean, if you follow that simple rule, then you'll find yourself a pretty decent person. Not always easy to do. Treat people with respect, treat them with kindness. Yeah. Sometimes as a leader, you got to have tough love. You got to hold them accountable. Doesn't mean you got to be a jerk about it. You can be a good person and still be a great leader. John Wooden, I'm reading John Wooden's Pyramid of Success again. And it never ceases to amaze me. The whole fundamental of Wooden's Pyramid of Success was about being a good person.
Interesting. And then I guess something else that just makes me think of is the power of repetition, because these are
Yeah.
simple, but we need to be reminded of them. Okay, maybe last question as we wrap up here. Uh, you've been involved in some incredible operations throughout your career. Do you ever get scared? Or if you or in those moments where you might have gotten scared, how did you manage your emotions in those moments?
Yeah, of course you're scared all the time. I mean, that's kind of the nature of the job. But part of it is, you're trained. And your training puts you in a position where if something is going south on you, you've been trained to deal with that. Because in the military, and it's true of a lot of places, where you're working in kind of high pressure or dangerous jobs, you're taught how to get out of those difficult situations. So you fall back on a lot of your training. And my wife and I were just talking about this last night. I'm reading a new book by Sebastian Junger called "In My Time of Dying," and Junger is a kind of a war correspondent reporter, but he has an abdominal aneurysm and he almost dies, and he's kind of reflecting on his life. But he talks about his time in Afghanistan or Iraq. I forget where he got hit by an IED, and it really had an effect on him. What I told my wife was, interestingly enough, things like that rarely bothered me. I mean, you were always having kind of a near-death experience in the SEAL teams, even in training and certainly in combat. And yes, you were afraid, but if you reflected too much on it, it could paralyze you. So, one day you don't get hit by an IED, or you do get hit by an IED, but you survive it. Or, I was in Iraq and mortars. I lived for a little while. I was in a trailer, and I woke up one morning to find that the bad guys had been firing mortars, and they had hit all around my trailer, but none of them had hit my trailer. And I thought, well, that's a little disconcerting. So I went to bed that night thinking, well, I guess it could land on me, but you know what? I got to get some sleep. And then I never thought about it again. So people deal with it in different ways. But, for me, you take that fear and you bury it down deep inside, and you put every kind of barricade you can, emotional barricade you can around it. The problem with that, though, is over time, things start to seep out. And
Mhm.
I've certainly found in my time in retirement or my time after the military that, some of those emotions that I bottled up begin to seep out. And when that happens, for the young men and women that have experienced trauma in whatever field they've been in, you need to get help. You need to go talk to somebody. You need to find out, why these things are bothering you. Some of them may not have appeared apparent at the time, but over time you can't avoid them. They will find their way into your psyche, and you need to deal with them.
Well, and it just makes me think something I've learned, or the phrase that I really like. There are no solutions, only trade-offs. And so at the time, you
Yeah,
may have to behave in a way that's going to help you in the short run, that maybe you have to pay a price in the long run, but it certainly gets you through the
exactly.
short run. Well, this has been so great, Bill. I really appreciate your time. And what I also really enjoyed about this is you've demonstrated in just talking about the books that you're reading and still trying to learn, that you're still trying to know the business and know
Have
the
to.
details. So really appreciate you sharing these lessons today, and can't wait to share these lessons with others.
Thanks, Nate. It was my pleasure.
Okay, I'll hit stop.